It's time for the big one, comparing the Gibson Les Paul Custom to the Epiphone inspired by Gibson Les Paul Custom, both in ebony color. These look pretty identical, especially on photos. A lot of people claim that the Gibson is just a rebranded Epiphone, but there are some major differences. I'm gonna demonstrate both guitars and explain all of the differences. How much time do you have? The Epiphone website again, and look who it is, Matt Heafy. Man, I wanna review one of his Les Paul Origin Customs so bad. If anybody has one of these and wanna make a video about it, please hit me up on Facebook, on Instagram. Anyway, electric guitars, original Les Paul. In here we find the Jerry Cantrell vinyl that I've already reviewed, the Cantrell Prophecy that I've reviewed, and the Les Paul Custom. The Epiphone Les Paul Custom comes in two colors, the Alpine White, which I'm gonna review. I had it in the shop, it's sold, but the owner is gonna bring it back for a video. It looks amazing in person. There's also a Koa version that I'm gonna try to find and review for you guys, but today we're gonna do the most desirable of them all, the Ebony. The latest generation of the Epiphone Les Paul Custom was introduced in 2020 as a part of the Inspired by Gibson collection. It has a set of Probucker 2 and 3 pickups, which are sort of a jack of all trades for Epiphone. They can pretty much do everything from cleans to soaring leads. What's even cooler is that as a part of the Inspired by Gibson collection, the Epiphone has the Gibson electronics, the CTS 500K pods for example. It features a full thickness Les Paul shaped body, double bound with the gorgeous ebony finish and a gold hardware to go along with it. You gotta keep one thing in mind if you want a Les Paul though. Usually they are heavy. Even though the Epiphone is a little bit lighter than the Gibson, it still weighs around 9 pounds. I love the combination between the 60s slim taper neck profile and the ebony fingerboard. There's just something about dark fingerboards with block inlays that speaks to me every time. It says, buy me. To top it all off, for the Inspired by Gibson collection in 2020, Epiphone brought back the Kalamazoo headstock. Looks much better in my opinion. The mother of pearl custom diamond is bigger as well. As you've probably already guessed, I love the new Epiphone Les Paul Custom. But you're here for something else, aren't you? You want me to compare the Epiphone Les Paul Custom to the full-blown Gibson made in the custom shop Nashville Les Paul. I'm about to do just that, but first I wanna tell you, I was surprised. I did not expect the Epiphone to be that good and perform that well against the Gibson. Don't get me wrong, I'm not ready to throw away my Gibson Les Paul Custom just yet, but for 6 times cheaper than the Gibson, the Epiphone performs and looks amazing. It's time I show you the similarities and the differences. Let's check out the official listing for the Gibson and the Epiphone. I'm gonna start with the Gibson Les Paul Custom, which is listed at almost $5,000 and it comes in two colors, the Alpine White and the Ebony. Keep in mind that even though I'm showing you a Gibson Les Paul Custom from 2019, it has the same specs as the 2022 ones. Speaking of the specs, two of them are important. It has a long neck tenon and it has an ebony fingerboard. In fact, I've already reviewed the Gibson Les Paul Custom. I'm gonna link the video above so you can see it. Don't try to memorize the specs now, I have a chart comparing both guitars later. On to the Epiphone Les Paul Custom. It comes in two colors, the Alpine White and the Ebony. It costs $729. As usual, I'm gonna give you the official listing from the Epiphone website and a couple of seconds on screen with the specs. There are many differences with the Gibson and I'm gonna go through all of them. You better get something to eat or drink, get comfortable, because it's gonna be a long one. Starting with the main difference, which is obvious, the price. The Gibson costs $5,000, the Epiphone costs $729. There is a good reason for that. The Gibson is made in the Nashville custom shop. The Epiphone, on the other hand, is made in Qingdao, China. Obviously, they are made out of different materials. The Gibson has the highest grade mahogany, ebony and maple. The Epiphone has the same materials but much lower wood grade. Then there's the construction itself. They're both Les Paul, both have set neck construction. But the body of the Gibson is made out of a single piece high grade mahogany and two pieces of plain maple. The Epiphone, on the other hand, is made from two pieces mahogany for the back, lower grade, and two or three pieces of plain maple for the top. For the fingerboards, we have ebony in both the Gibson and the Epiphone, but the Gibson has much higher grade of ebony. It has less pores, it's more consistent overall. Let me demonstrate. Check out the last frets and now look at them on the Epiphone. The lighter in color pores are clearly visible on the Epiphone. Both fingerboards are oiled. The other obvious difference is the headstock. The Gibson has the open book or the mustache design, multiply binding, Gibson mother of pearl logo and the custom diamond. The Epiphone has the Kalamazoo style of headstock, mother of pearl logo and the diamond, but you can clearly see that the grade of the mother of pearl used is quite different on the Gibson and on the Epiphone. Not that shiny on the Epiphone. The truss rod cover bells are different as well, 3 screws for the Epiphone and 2 screws for the Gibson. The font is a little bit different as well, I'm gonna demonstrate later in the video. The nuts are different, new bone by Graphtec on the Epiphone versus Korean, a bit hard to see through the camera, sorry. Anyway, the nut is much smoother on the Gibson. The necks are quite different as well. Starting with the block inlays, the Gibson has the mother of pearl inlays versus the pearloid plastic inlays on the Epiphone. Then there's the profile. The Gibson is thinner around the 12th fret, but it's chunkier in the back. It has a rounded C shape that makes it feel a little bit thicker than on the Epiphone. The Epi is a bit wider at the 12th fret, but the neck is much flatter and it feels thinner. So these two necks are quite different in profile, but both feel comfortable. The frets are quite different as well, even though they are listed as medium jumbo on both guitars. They are much more rounded off on the Gibson and they have the fret edge binding. The frets on the Epiphone have a little bit of a triangle shape, they're sharper and they don't have the fret edge binding. Another big difference is that Gibson has the one-way adjustable truss rod that they had been using since the 50s, while the Epiphone has the two-way adjustable truss rod with an Allen nut 4mm. The differences in the body. The Gibson body is slightly thicker than the Epiphone, and Gibson mentions that it has 9-hole weight relief even though it's heavier than the Epiphone. This is due to the different grades of materials used in both guitars. But keep in mind that heavier doesn't always mean better. On to the finish. Gibsons have nitrocellulose lacquer finish, meaning that it's gonna age in time, the binding is gonna get yellow. It's harder to see on the black guitars, but for example the Snow White Gibsons get yellow with time. The Epiphone, on the other hand, has the polyurethane finish that doesn't age the same way. Nitro feels softer to the touch and gets yellow over time. I'm gonna link a couple of videos above with my 76 Gibson Les Paul Custom and an Alpine White that has aged beautifully over time to demonstrate this. So polyurethane finish for the Epiphone, nitro for the Gibson. Comparing the hardware. Starting with the tuners, The Gibson has the Grover kidney tuners. The Epiphone usually has the Grover automatic 18:1 ratio ones, but these are different and they're a bit of a surprise for me. I'm gonna demonstrate them later in the video. I was genuinely surprised to see that brand on a 2022 Epiphone. They feel similar to the Grover on the Gibson, but they're made in another factory. Most importantly, the pickups. Gibson 490R in the neck, 498T in the bridge, designed by Epiphone Probucker 2 and 3 here. The bridge and tailpiece. The Gibson has the Nashville to Pneumatic Imperial bridge and the stop bar to go with it. Epiphone lock tone locking bridge and a tailpiece, metric. And here's something that I didn't notice and didn't expect. A friend pointed it out to me. The distance between the pickups on the Gibson differs with the distance between the pickups on the Epiphone. There's also a difference between the distance of the bridge pickup and the bridge here and on the Epiphone. You can clearly see it. I'm gonna measure it later in the video and demonstrate for you. There are some differences in the electronics as well. The Gibson has, I think, the Switchcraft 3-way pickup selector, and here we have the cheaper Epiphone branded one. As a part of the Inspired by Gibson collection, the Epiphone has the CTS 500K pods. The Gibson has the same, but they're branded Gibson. The output jack on the Gibson is higher quality as well. These are things that you can easily replace though, so not a big deal. The Gibson comes in a custom shop hard shell case with a certificate of authenticity. The Epiphone comes in a cardboard box. No need to remember all of that information, I've summed it all up here. You can pause at any time and read all of the differences between the 2019, 2022, 23 spec Gibson Les Paul Custom and the 2022 Epiphone Les Paul Custom. Now that I explained and showed you most of the differences, can you tell which guitar is which? Maybe I did a switcheroo, maybe I didn't. Just looking at the bodies, can you tell which one is which? Look closely, but don't cheat, don't skip forward. Is this the Gibson or is it the Epiphone? Ready for the reveal? I'm gonna show you the headstocks now. The block inlays are a dead giveaway. How many of you got it right? Before I start with my in-depth review of the Epiphone, I wanna point a couple of things out. The Chinese workers need to take a little more care when doing these models. Notice the nut, the way it has been cut. I'm assuming QC passed it because it's under the strings, but it could have been better. There are some glue marks here and there on the fingerboard that I'm gonna clean. Some dirt and instrument marks on the binding, and the Ebony fingerboard definitely can benefit from some oil. So I'm gonna clean up the nut, the fingerboard, I'm gonna polish the frets, oil the fingerboard. There we go, I've polished the frets using Music Nomad Fine fret polish. I've oiled the fingerboard with the good old trusty F1 oil, and I've been using this one since, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 years, over 500 guitars, and you see how much of it is left. They've made the new package much smaller now, but this one is the old one. I've managed to clean all of the glue, the fingerboard is conditioned and oiled. I couldn't get rid of these marks here on one of the frets, but it's okay. The entire fingerboard looks much better now, and I think the nut is okay as well. Finally, a guitar that feels just like home for me with the specs. We have a 2-piece mahogany body, 2 or 3-piece plain maple top under the ebony finish, multiply binding for the top and the back, multiple pieces mahogany neck with a set neck construction, ebony fingerboard, 22 medium jumbo frets, block inlays, Kalamazoo headstock with the custom diamond, Wilkinson tuners, and a new bone nut by Graphtec. A set of Probucker pickups, the 2 and 3 by Epiphone. The controls are bridge volume, bridge tone, neck tone, black speed knobs as on most Gibson and Epiphone Les Paul Customs. Long shaft pots which are raising the speed knobs above the top. This is where the craftsmanship shows because it's hard to follow the curvature of the top. You see how they're done on the Gibson? A little bit better. Now the poker chip and the 3-way switch is something I would immediately replace on the Epiphone. You hear the way it operates. Now these are not bad, but they can be greatly improved like the ones on the Gibson. This switch is so much smoother. I suggest you replace this with a Switchcraft mech or anything better than the one that Epiphone is using. But this is an easy fix, these are cheap. Here's a big difference. The Epiphone has the Probucker 2 and Probucker 3 pickups that measure quite different from the Gibson. Starting with the Probucker 3 in the bridge position, that measures 8.53k ohms, switching over to the Probucker 2 in the neck, 788. This one is closer to the Gibson. Middle position 409. So the Probucker 3 measures a lot softer than the 498T on the Gibson, which you can feel on the hand when you're attacking the string. A little less gain and looser, but overall recorded sounds pretty close to the Gibson. Let me show you the Gibson. By the way, my favorite set of pickups, the 498T in the bridge at 1323, a lot hotter as I said. The 490R at 770 in the neck position, and middle position 486. Something I noticed when measuring the pickups, both guitars are positioned perfectly on top of each other. Check out the position of the output jacks. The Epiphone is more towards the bottom of the guitar, the Gibson more towards the back. For the Gibson we have Grover kidney tuners and the Gibson bridge and tailpiece. The Epiphone has the Wilkinson tuners and Epiphone lock tone bridge. You can see these bridges on almost all of the Epiphones that I've reviewed recently. Epiphone logo on the bottom, they lock through the struts. Individual cellos held in place by a spring that is slightly out of place. Let me try and fix this off camera. There we go. Now it's snapped into place and it's holding the individual cellos. Metric, thumb wheel and flathead screwdriver adjustable. And even though that it's a good bridge, stays in place, intonates properly, I would replace this one just to upgrade the guitar. I was considering swapping the tuners as well, but these Wilkinsons are actually pretty good. Here's the Epiphone lock tone tailpiece that goes together with the bridge. I gotta say, Epiphone got the pickguard pretty close to the one on the Gibson. They look and feel similar. 2 screws for the pickguard, but remember that difference in the spacing between the pickups that I'm about to demonstrate a little bit later in the video. Time to discuss the body, top and the finish. These two might look the same, but they are quite different, like replica sunglasses imitating the original. They get the basic shape right, even the carve of the top, they get the color right, but the materials used and the craftsmanship are quite different. A single piece high grade mahogany for the Gibson and 2-piece maple top versus 2 pieces of lower quality mahogany and 2 or 3 pieces of plain maple for the top of the Epiphone. Then there's the finish, polyurethane for the Epiphone versus nitrocellulose lacquer for the Gibson, which looks and feels quite different in person. Polyurethane on the Epiphone looks so much smoother and almost feels like plastic, which is absolutely normal. Most affordable guitars have the polyurethane finish, in fact some expensive ones do as well. It's a matter of personal preference. I seem to prefer the nitrocellulose on the Gibson. Feels softer, has a certain smell to it, which is like smells like expensive, I don't know how to explain it, and it ages differently. The nitro is supposed to be the more natural finish, which allows the guitar to breathe, to age differently and resonate better than poly. As I said, a matter of personal preference. A lot of people don't like their guitars to age. I love it, and it doesn't show that much on an ebony finish. I've already linked for you guys my 76 Gibson Iron Cross and the Alpine White videos, in which you can see how nitro ages over time. This is the ebony finish, so it's not gonna show that much, but if it was white or silver burst, it would already turn yellow or greenish. And you can clearly see the way that my 76 aged. The diamond went yellow. It's not the paint and the mother of pearl that aged, it's the nitro finish on top of them. Time to discuss the neck, because there are a lot of differences between the Epiphone and the Gibson, even though they're both made out of mahogany. The Epiphone is made out of multiple pieces of mahogany, set neck construction of course. It is bound, it has black side dots, ebony fingerboard, 22 medium jumbo frets. The block inlays are made out of pearloid plastic. Let me demonstrate the difference between the pearloid and the mother of pearl that Gibson uses. You see how the mother of pearl on the Gibson reacts to the light, much more lively and better looking than the pearloid. What about the fretwork? Well, it seems to be immaculate on the Epiphone, no scratchy fret edges. They seem level. The difference is in the shape and the fret edge binding. You see the Epiphone doesn't have any of that. I'm gonna show you the Gibson. You see these? They are called fret nips or fret edge binding. It takes a lot of skill to make these consistent, so they're usually reserved for custom shop instruments, or at least high-grade instruments. The problem is that they are hard to preserve when you're doing a refret job on a guitar. Next up, remember I told you that there are different grade of materials used. The ebony fingerboard, for example, has lighter pores on the Epiphone. Check it out I'm giving you a closer look now. Look at the Gibson. Much more consistent, dense, almost look like the Richlight, but this is Ebony board. 2019 Gibsons have the Ebony boards. So higher grade Ebony for the more expensive guitar. Recently I started checking the inlays for consistency, especially the pearloid ones. Sometimes one or two of them are not following the pattern of the rest, they're too plain looking and stand out. In this case they're all good. Now look at the real mother of pearl in the Gibson. I know this is purely cosmetic, but given the chance, every time I would go for mother of pearl over pearloid. Remember what I told you about the shape of the frets? Medium jumbo in both guitars, but check out the Epiphone. They are like triangularly shaped, sharper. Now look at the Gibson. Much more rounded off, smoothed off. They seem wider as well. The nut is different as well. Epiphone went with new bone for the custom, which is a surprise for me. They should have gone with the Graphtec Tusk. A bit disappointing, even though it's done okay, seems alright, almost flush with the binding, but still. If this was my guitar, I would swap it out for bone immediately. The Gibson has a Korean nut, not even bone anymore, but it's much smoother, lower and flush to the binding. Time for the crown jewel, the custom diamond. Epiphone seemed to got it almost right with mother of pearl, but you can see that the one on the Gibson is much higher grade. Slightly bigger on the Gibson as well. I have to compliment Epiphone. I'm not sure about the logo, maybe it's pearloid, but the diamond is actual mother of pearl. And it's okay. You don't have to compare it to the Gibson per se, it looks okay by itself like this. Let's discuss the headstock shape for a second. What do you guys think about the Kalamazoo headstock for the inspired by Gibson Epiphones? Does it resemble the Gibson enough? The bigger diamond, do you like it more than the old style of Epiphone headstock? Another difference that I've already mentioned is the truss rod. The Epiphone has the two-way adjustable with an Allen nut 4mm, the Gibson has the traditional one-way in here. We got the Epiphone bell, 3 screws, 2-ply, Les Paul custom, white on the bottom, black gloss on the top. Check it out next to the Gibson. There are definitely some differences in the font. Like the Les Paul is bold on the Epiphone, the custom is thinner. Yeah, you get it, you see it. The nut is at 43mm for the Epiphone, 42.8 for the Gibson, a slight difference. 12 fret 53mm for the Epiphone. The Gibson is a little narrower at the 12th fret at 52.4mm. Thickness at the first fret of the Epiphone 20.5mm. The Gibson is a bit thicker at 21.3mm. Thickness at the 12th fret of the Epiphone 23.3. The Gibson is at 24.6. So the Epiphone has the thinner neck. Let's measure the body thickness, starting with the Epiphone at 49.5, almost a full thickness body. The Gibson at 50.3, slightly thicker. We'll get back to the differences in the neck in a second, there are a lot of them. Something else interesting that I've noticed when I was playing the pinch harmonics, they were much easier to do on the Gibson than on the Epiphone. This is due to the distance between the pickups. It's different on the Gibson. This difference in the distance between the pickups and the bridge pickup and the bridge itself was pointed out by a friend of mine who is a renowned Gibson connoisseur. Cheers, man. Let's measure it now. The distance between the pickup rings on the Epiphone is 58mm or 2.28 inches. The distance between the pickup rings on the Gibson is 2.36 inches. It's wider. Here's the more noticeable difference, the distance between the bridge pickup and the bridge, 18.5.72 on the Epiphone. On the Gibson, the pickup is much closer to the bridge at 11.8 or 0.46 inch. There you go. The fingerboard radius is 305mm or 12 inches on both guitars. The scale length is 24.75 inches on both guitars as well. But as I already mentioned, even though the scale is the same, the positioning of the pickups and the bridge make it feel slightly different. You notice it when doing techniques affected by these distances. Now I see why the neck is thinner on the Epiphone. It's not as rounded as on the Gibson. You see much more pronounced C shape on the Gibson, flatter on the Epiphone. Again, it's a matter of personal preference. I prefer the C shape, the rounded off of the Gibson. A lot of people prefer the flat one. A few people tried it here in the store, nobody complained about the neck. Still, I choose the Gibson. I'm gonna explain one of the biggest differences in the construction between the Epiphone and the Gibson. The Gibson's neck is made out of a single piece of mahogany, which means that all of this, the neck heel, the headstock with the angle, is made out of a single big chunk of mahogany. There's an excellent episode on Gibson TV dedicated especially to the mill room and the neck creation. You can check that out if you want to know more about the whole process. I'm gonna link it above for you guys. No scarf joint for the headstock, no separate piece for the neck heel, one big piece of mahogany. Only the wings are glued separately, not to waste too much wood for the sides here. The Epiphone on the other hand is done much differently. We have one big piece of mahogany here, starting from the neck joint going to the headstock, a separate piece for the neck heel that is glued to the neck itself, and then there's a scarf joint under the QC sticker down here, which connects the neck to the headstock. You cannot see the joints because of the ebony paint, but they are there. Utilizing this construction allows Epiphone not to throw away the excess wood and make at least two necks from the same chunk of mahogany that Gibson is using for a single neck. So in theory the Epiphone is much more environment friendly, less wood wasted. How does that affect playability and sustain? In theory, every joint loses some of the vibration that the guitar has. This is a dispute all this time. Some people say that the joints improve the sustain, others say they don't. Depends on the glue you're using. I would always prefer a single piece of wood, but that is expensive. For example, imagine the chunk of mahogany that you need to make the body out of a single piece of wood. That is expensive, especially if you want a high-grade, huge piece of mahogany. This is why Epiphone goes with multiple pieces of mahogany for their bodies and necks, much lower grade as well. Gloss finish on both necks, no volute on both of them. We have the QC inspection card sticker, also the handcrafted in China sticker here. I took out one of the Wilkinson tuners. Yeah, I'm surprised the Gibson has the Grover kidney tuners. I was expecting Grover automatics on the Epiphone, but surprised, they're Wilkinson. They're the same, just differently branded. That's curious. Wilkinson, made in Korea by Jinho. I've seen this brand on a lot of other guitars. These feel and tune pretty well actually, they're substantial and they weigh the same as the Grovers that you can find on the Gibson. So I wouldn't replace these Wilkinsons. I have to compare them to the Grover automatics that are on the spec lists, but these feel good. If you have Wilkinsons on your Les Paul custom Epiphone, don't be in a hurry to swap them out, they're good. Interesting, the 2022 Alpine White has the Wilkinsons as well. Let me know in the comment section guys, does your custom have Wilkinsons? Yeah, as expected the factory setup is non-existent, so I'm gonna set up the truss rod, I'm gonna set up the bridge and the pickup height to exactly match the ones on the Gibson for this comparison. The Gibson is heavier, weighs almost 10 pounds at 980. The Epiphone a little bit lighter at 904. Time to check out how the Epiphone sounds compared to the Gibson Les Paul Custom. Now let's hear someone who can actually demonstrate the Epiphone, and not just anybody, my friend who bought the Epiphone Les Paul Custom Vino Jerry Cantrell signature. I'm gonna translate what my friend is saying. First of all, we're commenting about the feel, the overall feel of the guitar. He says that the Gibson feels much more expensive to the hand. He says that this is normal because obviously one is more expensive and should feel better than the other one, due to the higher grade materials and craftsmanship. Remember, both guitars are set roughly the same. The other thing he pointed out is that the Gibson is much more dynamic, more responsive to what he's playing. Both of us agreed on one thing though, the Epiphone is not bad at all, especially for the price. It's an amazing instrument. He owns the Jerry Cantrell Vinyl as well, which I said is the perfect Les Paul custom Epiphone, but this one is second best so far. We are also discussing changing the pickups to the Gibson ones, changing the nuts, some of the hardware, the bridge and the three-way switch, and it will become much better instrument, the Epiphone.
Extra? Thank you very much, brother.
Yes.
The pros and cons for both guitars. Obviously, the Gibson is far more expensive at $5,000. I've already explained the reason for that high price, the materials used, the craftsmanship. The good news is that the Gibson is gonna retain value better than the Epiphone, even increase it over time. The question is, should you buy one? Well, here's an interesting opinion. A lot of people come to the shop and say, oh, I'm not a professional musician, I don't have to afford a Gibson, I can go with the Epiphone. But here's the thing, professional musicians actually use the more affordable stuff. I know a lot of musicians that come to the shop, and there are a couple of good reasons they give me for going with the more affordable guitar. They often play in small venues with a small stage, meaning that they easily bump into each other, the bass player, the guitar player. Second, usually the backstage is just a small room that is not even locked, so a lot of guitars get stolen during gigs. I've seen a lot of posts online about people losing their guitars during the gig. If you get the more affordable guitar, you can enjoy a couple of beers after the gig, not having to worry about your Gibson Les Paul Custom getting beaten or stolen after the show. It makes so much more sense to go with the more affordable Epiphone, because let me tell you, most venues, the small ones, the local venues, have crappy PA systems and monitors, so you will not be able to tell the difference in the sound between the expensive Gibson and the affordable Epiphone. You will only feel the playability. The Epiphone is good enough for that. Does this mean that the Gibson is just a collector's piece for people that play at home? Well, no, a lot of musicians actually use them on stage, you've seen it everywhere. You just have to be a little more careful with it. Last but not least, as I mentioned, the Gibson has the nitrocellulose lacquer, where the Epiphone has the polyurethane finish, meaning that the Gibson will age more than the Epiphone, and there are some people that don't like the way nitro ages, like the yellowish around the diamond, the binding will get yellow, where the Epiphone will stay looking like this for a long time if you treat it right and you're not a smoker. If you like aged guitars, go for the Gibson over the Epiphone. Now, a couple of questions that you all probably have. Can you tell the difference in a blind test? Yeah, definitely. When considering the playability, the Gibson feels much more expensive than the Epiphone, but the Epiphone holds its own. Both guitars are set the same way, the strings are the same, the string height is the same, the distance between the pickups and the string is the same, the bridge height, so you can still feel a lot of difference between the Gibson and the Epiphone. Maybe if I swap out the pickups for Gibson ones, change the three-way switch, the bridge, I might be able to confuse some people, in a blind test that is, but experienced guitarists will always feel the difference between the Gibson and the Epiphone. This is about playability and feel that you cannot explain in a video, you just have to try and feel it. Another big question is, should you own both? Well, they are different enough to justify owning both. The Epiphone is affordable. You can use the Gibson at home or the recording studio and play on stage with the Epiphone. I've seen some people do it in the guitar groups, so yeah, I would say it's justifiable to own both of these. What do I think about the Epiphone overall? I think it's amazing value for money. This guitar is actually crazy good for $729. Can it replace the Gibson Les Paul Custom? No, it cannot, but it doesn't have to. At the start of the video, before I did the full comparison, I was gonna say swap out the pickups, swap out the hardware, swap out the tuners, but the tuners are actually amazing. The pickups sound so close to the Gibson when recorded. In the room though, and in my hands, I could definitely tell the difference. If I am a guitarist on a budget though, I would definitely go for the Epiphone Les Paul Custom and pick up a nice hard shell case for it. I'm not gonna swap out the tuners, I'm gonna play it until the 3-way switch and the output jack breaks, then replace them. Eventually I would swap out the bridge as well. Here's the thing about the Epiphone Les Paul Custom, it's the highest grade of Epiphone, so this means it's a perfect platform for upgrades. If you get a low quality guitar, you can never make it better by changing the hardware and the pickups, yes a little bit, but the wood is still the lowest grade. With the Epiphone Les Paul Custom you already have the highest grade platform that you can only improve. Making this video was a lot of fun and I was actually surprised of the end results with the recorded sounds. The Epiphone Les Paul Custom sounds so close to the Gibson even with the probuckers. This guitar is amazing value for money. If you have the chance, buy one.